December 7th, 1941 changed everything. When Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, America didn't just lose battleships. The nation lost 16 million men to military service practically overnight. And nobody saw the real problem coming. Those 16 million workers had been building things. They'd been making cars, assembling machinery, constructing buildings, and operating factories across the entire country. Now they were gone. But America needed to fight a two-ocean war against industrial powerhouses like Germany and Japan. The United States had to produce more planes than anyone had ever built, more ships than existed in any navy, and more ammunition than had been fired in all previous wars combined. Military planners did the math. The numbers were impossible. There simply weren't enough workers left in America to meet production goals. The country faced a choice: find millions of new workers immediately, or watch the war effort collapse before it even started. So where do you find millions of skilled workers when every able-bodied man is either overseas or about to be? The answer was right there in American homes the entire time: more than 12 million women who'd been told their whole lives they couldn't possibly do factory work. The United States was about to discover something remarkable. The key to winning World War II wasn't just on the battlefield. It was sitting at kitchen tables, working in typing pools, and teaching in schoolrooms across America. And her name was Rosie the Riveter. The impossible math. Let's talk about what America was actually facing in early 1942. Germany had been building its war machine for nearly a decade. The Nazis had tanks, planes, and submarines already rolling off assembly lines when America was still making refrigerators and passenger cars. Japan controlled much of the Pacific and had a navy that had just demonstrated its striking power. Meanwhile, Britain was barely hanging on. The Soviet Union was bleeding out on the Eastern Front. America had to catch up, and fast. The War Production Board laid out requirements that sounded like science fiction. The country needed 300,000 aircraft, not just simple trainers, but complex bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These weren't cars with wings. Each bomber contained hundreds of thousands of individual parts, miles of wiring, and required precision assembly that had previously taken years to perfect. The military wanted them in months. Then there were the ships. Liberty ships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, landing craft, submarines. The Navy submitted requests that made shipyard managers think someone had added extra zeros by mistake. Building a single merchant ship had traditionally taken nearly a year. Now the government wanted thousands of them, and they wanted them yesterday. Kaiser's shipyards alone would need to hire tens of thousands of workers who didn't exist. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps added to the equation. So did artillery shells, bullets, bombs, and rockets. The Army calculated it needed 47 billion rounds of ammunition. That's not a typo, 47 billion. Someone had to manufacture every single one. And the men who knew how to operate that machinery were already boarding troop ships headed for North Africa and the Pacific. This is where the numbers became absolutely impossible. In 1940, America's entire labor force included around 55 million workers. 16 million of them, nearly 30%, were about to disappear into uniform. At the same time, war production demands meant factories needed to triple or quadruple their workforce. The math didn't work. There was no equation where American industry met wartime goals using only the workers who remained. Factory managers panicked. Detroit automakers converting to tank production looked at empty assembly lines. Aircraft manufacturers in California opened massive new facilities and had nobody to fill them. Shipyards on both coasts built new slipways with no welders to work them. The arsenal of democracy was about to become the arsenal of empty buildings and broken promises. Then someone asked the question that seemed obvious in hindsight but was radical at the time. What about women? Breaking every rule in the book. Picture this for a moment. You might assume this was an easy decision. The country needed workers. Women were available, so obviously you hire women. But 1942 America didn't work that way. Society had rules about what women could and couldn't do. Those rules were carved in stone, or so everyone thought. Before Pearl Harbor, working women existed, but they occupied a very specific slice of the economy. About 25% of American women worked outside the home. Most of them were young, single, or widowed. They were secretaries, teachers, nurses, domestic servants, and telephone operators. Some worked in textile mills or light manufacturing. But heavy industry? Absolutely not. The idea of women working in steel mills, aircraft factories, or shipyards wasn't just unusual, it was considered impossible. The cultural barriers were enormous. American society believed women lacked the physical strength for factory work. They supposedly couldn't handle the mental complexity of technical jobs. Magazine articles and radio programs constantly reinforced the message that a woman's place was in the home, raising children and supporting her husband. Churches preached it. Schools taught it. Even labor unions opposed hiring women, arguing it would depress wages and take jobs from men. There were practical concerns, too. Factories weren't designed for women. Restroom facilities didn't exist for female workers. Safety equipment came in men's sizes. Childcare didn't exist in industrial areas because nobody had ever needed it. The entire infrastructure of American manufacturing assumed every worker was male. And then there was the question of skill. Operating a riveting gun wasn't simple. Welding required steady hands and precise technique. Reading blueprints demanded spatial reasoning and mathematical ability. Building complex machinery meant understanding mechanical systems. Society had convinced itself that women simply didn't possess these capabilities. But the War Production Board didn't care about society's opinions. They cared about meeting production quotas. If women could do the work, prejudice would have to move aside. The question was whether anyone could convince millions of American women and their husbands, fathers, and brothers that factory work was acceptable, appropriate, and patriotic. The government launched the largest recruitment and propaganda campaign in American history. This wasn't just about posting help-wanted signs. The United States had to completely rewrite the cultural narrative about women's capabilities, women's roles, and women's duty to the nation. They had to make factory work fashionable, patriotic, and temporary enough not to threaten the social order. That's where Rosie the Riveter came in. Birth of an icon, consider the woman you probably picture when you hear Rosie the Riveter. She first appeared in February 1943. J. Howard Miller created her for Westinghouse Electric Corporation as part of an internal campaign to boost worker morale. The poster showed a woman in a blue work shirt and red polka dot bandana. Flexing her arm beneath the caption, "We can do it," she looked directly at the viewer with confidence and determination. This wasn't a delicate flower asking for protection. This was strength personified. Interestingly, that poster wasn't originally called Rosie the Riveter, and it wasn't widely distributed during the war. Westinghouse displayed it in factories for just 2 weeks. The image only became iconic decades later. But it captured something essential about what was happening across America. Women weren't just filling in temporarily, they were proving something fundamental about human capability. The actual Rosie the Riveter that Americans knew during the war came from Norman Rockwell. In May 1943, the Saturday Evening Post published Rockwell's cover illustration. It showed a muscular woman in work clothes, riveting gun across her lap, eating a sandwich during her lunch break. Her foot rested on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. The name Rosie appeared right on her lunchbox. This Rosie was powerful, confident, and utterly uninterested in traditional feminine delicacy. Rockwell's image appeared on newsstands across America, telling every woman who saw it that she could do this work. The name Rosie the Riveter came from a song recorded in early 1942 by bandleaders Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb. The upbeat tune celebrated Rosie the Riveter, a woman working overtime to help win the war while her boyfriend Charlie served in the Marines. Radio stations played it constantly. The lyrics made factory work sound exciting, important, and attractive. All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory, Rosie the Riveter. But Rosie wasn't just propaganda and posters. She was based on real women doing real work. Rose Monroe became one of the most famous. She worked as a riveter at the Willow Run aircraft factory in Michigan, building the 24 Liberator bombers. Film crews featured her in promotional films. She became the face of the campaign. Monroe was a widow with 2 young daughters, doing difficult, dangerous work to support her family and help win the war. Then there was Roswell Monroe, often confused with Rose Monroe, who also worked in aircraft manufacturing, and Rosalind Walter, who inspired the original song after working on the F-4U Corsair fighter plane assembly line, and Rose Bonavita, a riveter at a New Jersey aircraft plant who set a record by driving 3,345 rivets into the wing of a torpedo bomber during a single 6-hour shift. Her hands moved so fast that supervisors thought she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. These real Rosies proved the concept. Women could operate industrial machinery. They could work 12-hour shifts. They could master technical skills. They could meet production quotas. They could do the job and often do it better than the men they replaced. The image resonated because it was true. By the time Norman Rockwell painted his cover, women were already transforming American industry. The propaganda didn't create Rosie. It simply gave a name and face to something that was already happening in factories across the nation. The question wasn't whether women could do war work. Millions of them were already proving they could. The real question was how many more would join them and how fast. The recruitment machine. The War Manpower Commission coordinated the recruitment effort, but they had help from every corner of American society. Hollywood got involved immediately. Films started featuring women in factories as glamorous, patriotic figures. Since UNOA showed Claudette Colbert as a middle-class mother taking a welding job. Swing shift Maisie Stard and Southern as a showgirl who becomes an aircraft factory worker. These weren't documentary films, they were entertainment designed to make factory work seem appealing to women across America. Magazine advertisements reinforced the message. Companies ran ads showing well-dressed women heading to factory jobs. The copy emphasized that war work was temporary, patriotic, and wouldn't compromise femininity. One famous ad showed a woman in work clothes with the headline, "The girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a wow," referencing women ordnance workers. Another promised, "You can do it and still be beautiful." The government cleverly addressed women's fears and society's objections. Propaganda emphasized that war work was temporary, just until the boys came home. It stressed that women were fighting on the home front just as surely as their husbands, sons, and brothers were fighting overseas. Every rivet driven shortened the war. Every ship launched brought victory closer. Every plane built saved American lives. Churches joined the campaign. Ministers preached that supporting the war effort was a Christian duty. Women's groups organized recruitment drives. Local communities held rallies featuring women workers who spoke about their experiences. The message came from everywhere: your country needs you, and you can do this. Training programs appeared rapidly. The government funded crash courses in welding, riveting, blueprint reading, and machine operation. These weren't year-long apprenticeships. They were intensive weeks-long programs designed to get women onto factory floors as quickly as possible. Defense contractors created their own training facilities. Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and Lockheed hired instructors to teach women skills that had traditionally taken months to learn. The message worked. Women responded by the millions. Young single women saw adventure and good wages. Married women saw patriotic duty and household income their families desperately needed. Widows and mothers of servicemen saw a way to contribute directly to their loved ones' safety. By the end of 1942, women were flooding into war industries. They came from farms and small towns. They came from cities and suburbs. White women and black women, though racial segregation meant they often worked in separate facilities or different shifts. Mexican American women in California. Native American women who left reservations for the first time. Women who'd never imagined working outside the home suddenly found themselves operating drill presses, driving forklifts, and assembling bomber wings. The transformation happened at stunning speed. In 1940, roughly 12 million American women worked outside the home. By 1944, that number had reached 20 million, an increase of 8 million workers in just 4 years. These weren't women taking traditional female jobs. 6 million of them went into manufacturing, and most of those went into heavy industry that had been completely closed to women before the war. The aircraft industry saw the most dramatic change. In 1940, women made up about 1% of aircraft manufacturing workers. By 1944, women were 65% of the industry's workforce. In just 4 years, an entire industry went from essentially all male to nearly 2/3 female. And these facilities weren't making simple products. They were building the most technologically advanced machines in the world. America's desperation had forced the country to do something revolutionary, actually test whether women could perform skilled industrial work. The test was the largest social experiment in American history. And the results were about to change everything, not just about the war, but about what American society believed was possible. But getting women into factories was only the beginning. Now they actually had to do the work. The factory floor revolution. Walking into an aircraft factory in 1943 felt like entering a different world. The facilities were enormous, some buildings stretched half a mile long. The noise hit first, riveting guns hammering at ear-splitting volume, metal presses stamping out parts, drill presses screaming through aluminum sheeting. The smell came next. Hot metal, hydraulic fluid, industrial solvents, and welding fumes mixed into an atmosphere that burned your throat. And everywhere you looked, women were working. At the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, Ford Motor Company built B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line. This innovation revolutionized aircraft production. The facility employed 42,000 workers at its peak, and a substantial majority were women. They operated every station on the line. Women positioned massive bomber fuselage sections using overhead cranes. They drove thousands of rivets into wing sections. They installed intricate electrical systems with hundreds of connections. They calibrated instruments that pilots would trust with their lives. The B-24 wasn't a simple machine. Each bomber contained 1,200,000 individual parts. Just the aluminum skin required installing hundreds of thousands of rivets, each one driven to exact specifications. Too loose, and the skin wouldn't hold under stress. Too tight, and you'd crack the metal. Women learned to drive rivets perfectly by feel, at speed, hour after hour. Rosie the Riveter's record of 3,345 rivets in a single shift wasn't just about speed. It was about maintaining perfect precision while working at incredible pace. Boeing's plants in Seattle produced B-17 Flying Fortresses and later B-29 Super Fortresses. The B-29 was the most complex aircraft of the war. It featured pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and advanced systems that had never been attempted before. Women assembled these technological marvels. They read complex blueprints that looked like incomprehensible tangles of lines to untrained eyes. They measured tolerances down to thousandths of an inch. They solved problems when parts didn't fit or systems didn't work properly. Lockheed Aircraft in Burbank, California, employed thousands of women building P-38 Lightning fighters and other aircraft. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach produced dive bombers and transport planes with an overwhelmingly female workforce. Grumman on Long Island built F-6F Hellcat fighters that would dominate Pacific skies, built largely by women's hands. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, Republic Aviation in New York, North American Aviation in Kansas, every major aircraft manufacturer in America depended on women workers. The work was physically demanding in ways that would surprise anyone who hasn't done it. Riveting required holding a heavy pneumatic gun steady, while a partner held a bucking bar on the opposite side of the metal. The gun kicked with each rivet, bruising shoulders and arms. Women worked in cramped spaces inside bomber fuselages, sometimes hanging upside down or twisted into awkward positions to reach rivet locations. They climbed all over aircraft structures, worked on tall scaffolding, and maneuvered heavy parts that weighed 50 pounds or more. Welding presented different challenges. The work required absolute steadiness. A shaking hand produced weak welds that could fail under stress. Women learned to strike arcs, maintain proper electrode angles, and move at consistent speeds to produce perfect feeds. They wore heavy protective equipment and worked in intense heat. The bright welding arcs could damage eyes if you looked at them unprotected. The ultraviolet radiation could burn exposed skin like severe sunburn. Sheet metal work meant operating shears that could cut through fingers as easily as aluminum. Drill presses and milling machines could grab loose clothing or hair and pull workers into machinery. Industrial accidents happened regularly. Women lost fingers to presses, suffered burns from welding equipment, fell from scaffolding, and inhaled toxic fumes from solvents and paints. Safety standards existed, but production pressure sometimes meant shortcuts. Some women died on the job, though exact numbers are hard to determine because record-keeping was inconsistent. But something remarkable happened. Women didn't just match male production rates. Often they exceeded them. Supervisors reported that women paid closer attention to detail. They followed instructions more carefully. They asked questions when they didn't understand rather than pretending and making mistakes. Quality control improved in facilities that hired women workers. Defect rates dropped. When the military tested aircraft coming off assembly lines, planes built by female workers performed just as well as those built by men, and sometimes better. The learning curve was steep but fast. Women who'd never held a wrench were operating complex machine tools within weeks. Former teachers were reading engineering blueprints. Secretaries were programming industrial equipment. Homemakers were troubleshooting hydraulic systems. The transformation wasn't just about individual capability. It was about systematically disproving every assumption society had made about women's intellectual and physical limitations. By 1944, American aircraft factories were producing nearly 100,000 planes per year. Women built most of them. Every B-17 bombing Germany, every B-24 hitting targets in occupied Europe, every B-29 flying missions over Japan, women's hands had assembled those aircraft. Every P-51 Mustang escorting bombers to Berlin, every F-6F Hellcat shooting down Japanese Zeros, every transport plane carrying paratroopers into Normandy, women built them. Shipyards told similar stories. Kaiser shipyards hired thousands of women as welders, riggers, crane operators, and shipfitters. Building Liberty ships required welding miles of seams. Women worked on staging suspended over water, in ship's holds where the heat was unbearable, and in tight spaces between hull plates. They operated enormous cranes that lifted sections weighing tons. They read ship plans and positioned structural members with precision. The speed of ship construction accelerated dramatically. In 1941, building a Liberty ship took an average of 230 days. By 1943, the average was down to 42 days. Kaiser set a record by launching the Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15.5 hours from keeling to launch. That was a publicity stunt and not typical. Still, the acceleration was real, and women were central to making it happen. At Marin Ship in Sausalito, California, women made up significant portions of the workforce building Liberty ships, tankers, and Navy oilers. The Baltimore shipyards employed thousands of women. So did facilities in Mobile, Alabama, and Newport News, Virginia. On the West Coast and East Coast and Gulf Coast, women wielded welding torches and built the ships that carried supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific. Tank production, artillery manufacturing, ammunition factories, women dominated these industries too. They operated powerful presses that stamped out tank hulls. They assembled tank engines and transmissions. They loaded artillery shells with explosive charges, dangerous work that killed workers when accidents happened. They manufactured everything from rifle bullets to enormous naval gun shells. 47 billion rounds of ammunition didn't manufacture themselves. Women made them, billions upon billions of individual cartridges assembled by hand and machine. The sheer scale is hard to comprehend. By 1944, the American economy had been completely transformed. Industries that had never employed women now couldn't function without them. Production levels that had seemed impossible in 1941 became routine by 1944. And women were the reason why. Women in uniform, but factory work wasn't the only way women contributed to victory. More than 350,000 American women served in military uniform during World War II. Not as nurses exclusively, though nursing was crucial, but in combat support roles that had never existed before. The Women's Army Corps started as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in May 1942. Congress initially created the organization as an auxiliary rather than part of the actual army. This meant members had fewer benefits and protections than male soldiers. That changed in 1943 when WAC became WAC and members became full Army personnel. At its peak, WAC enrolled about 150,000 women. WAC members performed more than 200 different job specialties. They worked as mechanics, electricians, drivers, radio operators, and air traffic controllers. They operated switchboards at military bases, managed supply depots, and processed the mountains of paperwork that modern warfare required. WAC units served in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. They came under fire during air raids. Some were taken prisoner when the Japanese captured the Philippines. Oveta Kolpabi led WAC as its director and became the first woman to hold officer rank in the U.S. Army. She fought constant battles against military and civilian prejudice. Rumors circulated that WAC members were prostitutes or that the organization was a cover for immoral behavior. These rumors were completely false. They persisted because society couldn't imagine women serving in military roles without scandal. Hobby worked tirelessly to maintain WAC's reputation while expanding its role. The Navy created WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, in July 1942. The name was a forced acronym created to spell WAVES, but the organization was deadly serious. Over 100,000 women served in WAVES during the war. They worked in communications, intelligence, logistics, and training. Many served as instructors teaching male pilots, navigators, and gunners. WAVE's members operated the Navy's computers, mechanical calculating machines that computed ballistics tables, tide charts, and navigation data. WAVE's personnel couldn't serve on combat ships or in combat zones, but they freed male sailors for combat duty by handling shore-based operations. At the Navy's code-breaking facility in Washington, WAVE's members worked as cryptanalysts breaking Japanese naval codes. Their work directly contributed to American victories in the Pacific. The intelligence they helped produce gave U.S. commanders advanced knowledge of Japanese ship movements and battle plans. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve enrolled about 23,000 women. The Marines were the most resistant to accepting women, but manpower shortages left no choice. Marine Corps women worked in aviation support, supply, motor transport, and administrative roles. They served at Marine air stations and training bases across the United States. The Corps reluctantly admitted that women Marines performed superbly. Still, many male Marines never accepted their presence. The Coast Guard created SPARS, an acronym from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, in November 1942. About 13,000 women served in SPARS during the war. They worked in communications, clerical positions, and shore patrol. Some operated Lauren navigation stations that guided ships and aircraft. SPARS members served in Alaska, Hawaii, and throughout the continental United States. Then there were the WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots. This organization deserves special attention. What these women did was extraordinary, and the country treated them shamefully. WASP was created in August 1943, merging two earlier organizations. The program recruited experienced female pilots to ferry aircraft from factories to military bases, test repaired aircraft, and tow targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice. 1,102 women served as WASP pilots. They flew every aircraft the military operated: fighters, bombers, transports, even experimental jets. They delivered B-17s and B-24s from American factories to embarkation points for shipment overseas. They flew B-29 Super Fortresses, the most advanced and temperamental aircraft in the American arsenal. They towed target sleeves behind their aircraft while anti-aircraft gunners practiced shooting at them. This was dangerous duty that required nerves of steel. WASP pilots flew more than 60 million miles during the war. They delivered over 12,000 aircraft. 38 of them died in crashes and accidents. And what happened next was shocking. They weren't considered military personnel. WASP operated as civilian employees of the Army Air Forces. When a WASP pilot died, her family received no death benefits, no military funeral, no flag. Her fellow pilots had to collect money amongst themselves to ship her body home. Jacqueline Cochran directed WASP and fought unsuccessfully for the organization to receive military status. Congress refused, largely due to opposition from male civilian pilots who wanted those jobs for themselves after the war. In December 1944, with victory in sight and male pilots returning home, Congress disbanded WASP. The women went home with barely a thank you. For decades, the military refused to acknowledge their service. It took until 1977 for Congress to finally grant WASP veterans military status, and 2009 before they received the Congressional Gold Medal. The Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps deployed tens of thousands of nurses to combat zones. They served in field hospitals in North Africa, Italy, and France. They worked in hospitals in the Pacific Island campaigns, sometimes within range of enemy artillery. Nurses treated wounded soldiers under fire, performed emergency surgery in tents, and saved countless lives through skill and courage. More than 200 nurses died during the war. Dozens became prisoners of war when the Japanese overran the Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Elsie Ott became the first woman to receive the Air Medal after flying a dangerous medical evacuation mission from India. Flight nurses worked on medical evacuation aircraft, caring for wounded soldiers being transported from combat zones to hospitals. Captain Anne Bernadette served in the Pacific and was awarded decorations for her courage under fire. These women weren't support personnel in the rear. They were in the war, facing the same dangers as male soldiers. What stands out about women's military service is how completely they proved themselves capable. Every argument against women serving collapsed when confronted with reality. Women could handle military discipline. They followed orders and maintained standards. They could perform technical work. They operated radios, repaired equipment, and solved complex problems. They could handle danger. They stayed calm under air raids and kept working when threatened. They could fly aircraft. WASP pilots handled planes that many male pilots found intimidating. The military grudgingly admitted that women's service was essential. Without WAC, WAVES, and the other women's branches, the military couldn't have put 16 million men into combat. Women freed men for combat duty by handling shore-based and administrative work. But society wasn't ready to admit that women were soldiers. So the nation downplayed their service, treated them as temporary aberrations, and rushed to disband these organizations the moment the war ended. Beyond the assembly line, factory work and military service represent the most visible contributions women made to victory. But the home front effort went far beyond riveting and uniforms. Women transformed American society in dozens of ways that were less dramatic, but equally essential. Agriculture depended on women's labor during the war. With millions of farm workers gone to war or factory jobs, farms faced labor shortages that threatened food production. Women stepped into the gap. They drove tractors, harvested crops, and managed farm operations. The Women's Land Army, modeled on a similar British program, recruited women to work on farms. About 3 million women worked in agriculture during the war years. Many of them continued to work family farms when husbands and sons left. Victory Gardens represented another crucial contribution. The government encouraged every American family to plant gardens to supplement food production. This wasn't just symbolic patriotism, it was essential food policy. With shipping focused on military needs and farmers producing for the war effort, civilian food supplies were stretched thin. Victory Gardens produced 40% of American vegetables during the war. Women planted and maintained most of these gardens while managing households and often working in factories. Rationing required careful management. The government rationed gasoline, tires, meat, butter, sugar, coffee, and numerous other items. Women managed household rationing books, planned meals around what was available, and figured out how to feed families with limited resources. They stood in line at stores when scarce items became available. They learned to cook with substitutes and make meals from ingredients they'd never used before. Managing rationing wasn't glamorous, but it kept families fed while the military consumed enormous resources. The Red Cross depended almost entirely on women volunteers. 3 million women volunteered for the Red Cross during the war. They rolled bandages, prepared care packages, worked in blood donation centers, and staffed Red Cross facilities at military bases. They operated canteens where servicemen could get coffee and sandwiches. They wrote letters for wounded soldiers who couldn't write themselves. They provided emotional support and practical help to families dealing with loved ones overseas. USO centers across America and around the world relied on women volunteers. These centers provided entertainment, food, and places for servicemen to relax when off duty. Women organized dances, wrote letters, served food, and created moments of normalcy for men facing combat. Movie stars like Marlene Dietrich and Carol Lombard toured military bases and USO facilities. But thousands of ordinary women did the daily work of keeping USO centers running. War bonds financed the military effort. The government sold bonds to the public, essentially asking Americans to lend money to fund the war. Women organized war bond drives, sold bonds in communities across America, and purchased billions of dollars worth of bonds themselves. Movie stars, radio personalities, and celebrities appeared at bond rallies. But women volunteers did the organizational work that made drives successful. Secretary jobs in war industries often had bond quotas. Women were expected to purchase bonds regularly from their paychecks. Transportation systems needed workers as men left for military service. Women became bus drivers, streetcar operators, and taxi drivers. They worked for railroads in various capacities. In cities across America, women drove public transportation vehicles for the first time. Passengers sometimes objected to female drivers, but the buses ran on time and got people where they needed to go. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, employed thousands of women in intelligence work. Women worked as analysts, researchers, code breakers, and even field agents. Virginia Hall, an American working for British intelligence and later OSS, operated behind enemy lines in occupied France. She organized resistance operations despite having a prosthetic leg. The OSS discovered that women could gather intelligence effectively because enemy soldiers often underestimated them. Code-breaking operations employed hundreds of women. While the famous Bletchley Park operation in Britain gets most of the attention, American facilities at Arlington Hall and other locations employed many female cryptanalysts. These women worked on breaking Japanese diplomatic codes, analyzing German communications, and processing vast amounts of intercepted signals. Their work was classified and remained secret for decades after the war. Scientific research benefited from women's contributions. Women worked on the Manhattan Project, though mostly in subordinate roles. They performed calculations, processed data, and conducted experiments. Women operated the enormous calculating machines that performed the complex mathematics nuclear physics required. Remember, this was before electronic computers, so calculations were done mechanically or by hand. Civil defense organizations recruited women extensively. Air raid wardens, fire watchers, and auxiliary police included many women. They trained in first aid, firefighting, and emergency response. Cities conducted blackout drills where all lights had to be extinguished to simulate defending against air raids. Women enforced blackout rules and prepared for emergencies that fortunately never came to the American mainland. The efforts combined to create total mobilization. The war touched every American home, and women managed most of those home front operations. They stretched budgets, grew food, managed rationing, volunteered in communities, and kept society functioning while the nation fought across two oceans. None of this appeared in newsreels or received medals. But without it, the war effort would have collapsed. The hidden struggles what the propaganda posters didn't show tells another story entirely. Women's contributions came at significant cost, and the nation was often ungrateful for their sacrifices. The story of Rosie the Riveter has a darker side that doesn't fit neatly into inspirational narratives. Start with wages. Women doing the same work as men received substantially less pay. In factories, women typically earned 50 to 60% of what men had earned for identical jobs. Employers justified this with various excuses. Women were temporary. Women didn't need to support families. Women weren't as strong. None of these reasons held up under scrutiny. That didn't change paychecks. Some unions fought for equal pay, but many unions resisted hiring women at all and certainly didn't prioritize pay equity. The wage gap meant women workers faced financial struggles even while doing essential work. A single mother building bombers might still struggle to afford childcare, rent, and food on wages that were a fraction of what male workers had earned. Women supported families with incomes that assumed they had husbands providing primary support, but millions didn't. Widows, divorcees, and women whose husbands earned low military pay depended on factory wages that employers deliberately kept low. Sexual harassment was endemic. Women working in male-dominated environments faced constant inappropriate comments, unwanted advances, and worse. Supervisors sometimes demanded sexual favors in exchange for better assignments or job security. Women had little recourse. Complaining might mean being fired or blacklisted. The concept of sexual harassment as workplace discrimination didn't legally exist yet. Women were expected to tolerate whatever men did and be grateful they had jobs at all. Racial discrimination compounded difficulties for African American women, Latino women, and other women of color. Defense industries initially refused to hire Black women at all. When pressure from civil rights organizations forced integration, Black women received the worst jobs at the lowest pay. They cleaned factory floors, handled toxic materials without protection, and performed the most dangerous tasks. Segregated facilities meant separate restrooms, locker rooms, and lunch areas. White women often refused to work alongside Black women. Black women faced particularly harsh treatment. In many communities, white residents objected to Black women taking defense jobs at all. Attacks on Black defense workers happened in several cities. Housing discrimination meant Black women workers often couldn't find housing near factories, forcing them to commute long distances. After facing discrimination in factories all day, they returned to segregated communities where Jim Crow laws enforced second-class status. Childcare was chronically inadequate. The Lanham Act provided federal funding for childcare centers in defense industry areas, but the program never met demand. Many women had no access to childcare at all and had to improvise. They left children with neighbors, older siblings, or relatives. Some women worked night shifts so they could care for children during the day and sleep only a few hours. The stress of managing childcare while working long factory shifts exhausted women physically and emotionally. The double shift became standard. Women worked 8, 10, or 12-hour factory shifts, then came home to cook, clean, care for children, manage households, and deal with all the rationing and wartime shortages. Men who worked long hours came home to relax. Women came home to a second job. The exhaustion was cumulative and crushing. Some women collapsed from sheer fatigue. Social stigma created additional stress. Despite propaganda celebrating women workers, many communities looked down on women who worked in factories. Neighbors gossiped that working women were neglecting children. Churches sometimes suggested women were abandoning proper roles. Women who enjoyed factory work or wanted to continue after the war were considered unfeminine or unnatural. The cultural messaging was contradictory. The country needed women to work, but also disapproved of women who worked. Relationships suffered under the strain. Husbands overseas sometimes reacted badly to news that wives were working in factories. Traditional gender roles were being upended, and not everyone welcomed the change. Some marriages broke under the stress of separation combined with women's growing independence. Divorce rates increased during and after the war. Work conditions remained dangerous throughout the war. Production pressure meant safety shortcuts. Women worked with toxic chemicals without adequate protection. Beryllium exposure caused lung disease. Lead paint caused poisoning. Industrial solvents caused reproductive problems and cancers that wouldn't be recognized for decades. The long-term health consequences of wartime exposure remain difficult to quantify because nobody tracked them carefully. And over everything hung the constant fear. Women building bombers had husbands, brothers, and sons flying those bombers into combat. Gold Star mothers, women who'd lost sons in combat, went to factories and built weapons through their grief. Women read casualty lists in newspapers every day, terrified they'd see familiar names. They worked while not knowing whether loved ones were alive or dead, safe or in danger. The emotional toll was enormous. The hidden struggles don't diminish women's achievements, they highlight how remarkable those achievements were. Women contributed despite discrimination, inadequate pay, harassment, and exhaustion. They worked through grief, fear, and physical danger. They supported the war effort while society simultaneously exploited and undervalued them. That makes their contributions more impressive, not less. By 1944, American industry was producing war material at levels that staggered the imagination. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines at rates of 100,000 per year. Shipyards launched multiple Liberty ships every day. Ammunition factories produced billions of rounds. And women were the primary reason this production miracle happened. But the story was just reaching its climax. The production miracle by spring 1944, America had become something unprecedented in human history, an industrial superpower operating at maximum capacity with a workforce that barely existed 4 years earlier. The numbers tell a story that still seems impossible. The United States was outreducing Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Not by a small margin, by a staggering, war-winning margin that made Allied victory mathematically inevitable. Consider these numbers for a moment. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 300,000 aircraft. 300,000. That's more planes than the rest of the world combined. Germany produced around 120,000 aircraft during the entire war. Japan built roughly 76,000. Britain manufactured about 130,000. The Soviet Union, despite its enormous industrial effort, produced around 157,000 aircraft. America alone exceeded all Axis production and nearly matched all Allied production from other nations. And women built most of them. Remember that aircraft industry statistic, 65% female workforce by 1944. When you look at those 300,000 aircraft, you're looking at women's hands riveting fuselages, installing engines, wiring electrical systems, and mounting weapons. Every B-17 Flying Fortress that bombed German industry. Every B-24 Liberator that struck Romanian oil fields. Every B-29 Super Fortress that would eventually bring Japan to its knees. Women built them. Tanks and military vehicles multiplied the impact. American factories produced roughly 88,000 tanks during the war. The M4 Sherman medium tank became the backbone of Allied armored forces, reliable, mass-produced, and available in quantities that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer numbers. Beyond tanks, American industry manufactured 2,632,000 trucks and jeeps. These vehicles gave Allied armies mobility that Axis forces couldn't match. German and Japanese soldiers often walked or used horse-drawn transport. American soldiers rode in trucks women assembled. Ships created the logistics network that made everything else possible. American shipyards launched almost 6,000 ships during the war. That includes 141 aircraft carriers, the Essex-class fleet carriers that dominated the Pacific and escort carriers that protected Atlantic convoys, 22 battleships, hundreds of cruisers and destroyers, 630 submarines that devastated Japanese shipping, and nearly 3,000 Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that hauled supplies across oceans to keep Allied forces fighting. Kaiser's shipyards achieved production speeds that seemed impossible. The average construction time for a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days in early 1941 to 42 days by 1943. The record-breaking Robert E. Peary 4 days and 15.5 hours from keeling to launch was a publicity stunt using prefabricated sections. But it demonstrated what American industry could accomplish. Women welders made this speed possible. They worked around the clock in shipyards from California to Maine, joining the massive steel sections that became the cargo vessels feeding Allied armies. Ammunition production reached mind-boggling levels. American factories manufactured 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 47 billion. They produced 41 billion individual rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition alone. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades, bombs, the quantities defy comprehension. Every bullet fired by an American soldier, every shell launched by American artillery, every bomb dropped by American aircraft, women manufactured them. What did this mean on the battlefield? American forces never ran out of ammunition. They never lacked for trucks to transport supplies or ships to carry reinforcements. They never faced shortages of aircraft or tanks that might turn tactical defeats into strategic disasters. The cornucopia of American production meant Allied commanders could afford to use overwhelming force. They could replace losses almost immediately. The industrial weight of American production, built on women's labor, crushed Axis resistance through sheer material superiority. Germany and Japan couldn't compete. German industry struggled with labor shortages, raw material scarcity, and Allied bombing. German factories used slave labor from concentration camps and conquered territories, workers who were starved, brutalized, and had every incentive to sabotage production. American factories used motivated workers who understood they were building weapons to protect loved ones overseas. The quality difference showed in battlefield performance. Japan's situation was even worse. The island nation lacked raw materials and faced submarine attacks that strangled supply lines. Japanese industry couldn't match American production even early in the war. The gap widened catastrophically as America's industrial mobilization reached full power. By 1944, Japanese factories were being bombed and running out of materials while American production accelerated. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, acknowledged that the arsenal of democracy was the foundation of Allied victory. Every strategic decision he made assumed American production would provide whatever forces needed. Planning the Normandy invasion, Eisenhower knew he'd have the landing craft, the aircraft, the vehicles, the ammunition, everything required to put armies ashore and keep them supplied. That confidence came from American industry. And American industry ran on women's labor. The multiplication effect is crucial to understand. Every additional aircraft shortened the war by enabling more bombing missions, more air superiority, more tactical support for ground forces. Every additional ship meant more supplies delivered, more troops transported, more pressure on enemy positions. Every additional tank, truck, or weapon system added incremental advantage that accumulated into overwhelming superiority. Women weren't just building equipment, they were building victory, rivet by rivet, weld by weld. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, American and Allied forces had amassed an invasion fleet and air armada that represented the peak of this production miracle. Everything converged on the beaches of Normandy, and everything traced back to factories where women worked. D-Day and the European Campaign. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944 hid the largest amphibious invasion in history. 5,000 ships approached the Normandy coast. Overhead, 13,000 aircraft provided cover and struck German positions. The ships carried 156,000 troops, thousands of vehicles, mountains of supplies, and everything needed to crack Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This was the moment when American industrial might translated directly into military action. And women's contributions were written into every element of the invasion. The landing craft that carried soldiers to the beaches, LCVs, LCIs, LCTs, and other designs came from American shipyards where women worked. The C-47 transport planes that dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines rolled out of factories where women installed engines and rigged controls. The B-17s and B-24s that bombed coastal defenses were aircraft women assembled. The trucks that would soon roll off landing ships and across France came from plants where women operated assembly lines. The rifles soldiers carried, the ammunition they fired, the rations they ate, women produced all of it. American air power over Normandy represented years of production. The 8th Air Force and 9th Air Force put thousands of bombers and fighters into French skies. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German positions. P-51 Mustangs provided fighter escort. B-26 Marauders hit tactical targets. Medium and heavy bombers struck transportation networks and fortified positions. These aircraft gave Allied forces air superiority that German defenders couldn't challenge effectively. Luftwaffe fighters that did appear were quickly overwhelmed by numbers that American production made possible. The logistical miracle that followed the invasion depended entirely on sustained production. Armies crossing France consumed enormous quantities of supplies. Ammunition expenditure reached levels that seemed impossible to sustain. A single infantry division could fire more artillery shells in a day of heavy combat than entire armies used in previous wars. Tank units required constant fuel supplies. Vehicles broke down and needed replacement parts or complete replacement. Medical supplies, food, clothing, communications equipment, everything had to flow continuously from America to combat zones. Liberty ships and other cargo vessels maintained this supply line. They crossed the Atlantic loaded with material, unloaded in British ports or directly onto French beaches after the invasion, then returned to America for more. The ships women built created a conveyor belt of supplies that kept Allied armies advancing. When German forces launched their desperate counterattack in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American logistics recovered from initial setbacks because supply stockpiles existed to replace losses. Those stockpiles came from American factories. Aircraft production directly affected the strategic bombing campaign that devastated German industry. Throughout 1944, American bombers struck German factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and synthetic fuel plants. These raids gradually strangled German war production. Each bomber lost to German fighters or anti-aircraft fire could be replaced quickly. American factories produced replacements faster than Germany could shoot them down. German aircraft losses couldn't be replaced at anything like the same rate. The mathematics of attrition favored America overwhelmingly. American factories graduated new bombers every day. Boeing plants alone produced more than 12,000 B-17s during the war. Consolidated produced nearly 19,000 B-24s. These aircraft absorbed horrendous losses. The 8th Air Force suffered the highest casualty rates of any American military unit, but the losses didn't stop the campaign because new aircraft arrived constantly. German industry couldn't match this production rate. Each bomber shot down represented an irreplaceable loss. Tank production demonstrated similar dynamics. American Sherman tanks had mechanical advantages and disadvantages compared to German designs. But American industry produced them in quantities that made tactical weaknesses strategically irrelevant. When a Sherman was knocked out, another replaced it. Often several more replaced it. German Tiger and Panther tanks were formidable weapons, but Germany produced them in thousands. America produced Shermans in tens of thousands. Numbers mattered. Women built those Shermans. They assembled the engines, mounted the guns, installed the radios and instruments, and prepared the vehicles for shipment overseas. Tank plants in Detroit employed thousands of women. Chrysler's tank arsenal operated with a substantially female workforce. Every Sherman that rolled through French villages, crossed the Rhine, and pushed into Germany carried women's work. The advance across Western Europe from June 1944 to May 1945 demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak. Allied forces could afford to use material lavishly because supply was essentially unlimited. American artillery operated under doctrines that emphasized maximum firepower. When in doubt, call in artillery. American forces used this approach because they had the shells to fire. German forces couldn't match this firepower because they lacked ammunition. Air support became routine. Need to clear a defended village? Call in fighter bombers. Enemy tanks spotted? Airstrikes could hit them before ground forces engaged. This level of air-ground coordination required huge numbers of aircraft, trained pilots, bombs, fuel, and replacement parts. The entire system depended on production accomplished largely by women. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich collapsed under weight it couldn't bear. The industrial output of the United States, combined with Soviet manpower and British resilience, crushed German resistance. American production wasn't the only factor in victory, but it was absolutely essential. Without the aircraft, tanks, trucks, ships, and ammunition American factories provided, Allied victory would have taken much longer, if it came at all. And American production rested on women's shoulders. The Pacific Theater victory simultaneously with the European campaign, the Pacific War showcased American industrial power even more dramatically. The distances involved, the amphibious nature of operations, and the need to project power across the world's largest ocean created logistical challenges that only American production capacity could meet. Women's contributions proved decisive here as well. The Pacific War was fundamentally a naval and air war. Island-hopping campaigns required amphibious assaults supported by massive naval forces and overwhelming air superiority. Every successful landing depended on ships to transport forces, aircraft to provide cover, and the industrial capacity to replace losses and sustain operations thousands of miles from home. American carrier task forces dominated the Pacific after 1943. The Essex-class fleet carriers built in American shipyards gave the Navy striking power that Japan couldn't match. Each carrier carried roughly 100 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, all built in American factories. Women welded the carriers' hulls and assembled the aircraft they carried. When these task forces struck Japanese positions, women's work delivered the blows. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated American material superiority decisively. American carriers launched aircraft that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses were catastrophic, approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. American losses were minimal. The disparity reflected both pilot training and material superiority. American aircraft were generally superior, and American forces had them in overwhelming numbers because American factories built them faster than Japan could destroy them. B-29 Superfortress bombers represented the technological peak of American aircraft production. These enormous four-engine bombers featured pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and the longest range of any bomber in the world. They were also nightmarishly complex to build. The B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project. Engine problems plagued early production. The aircraft required precision manufacturing at scale that pushed American industry to its limits. Women built B-29s. At Boeing's plants in Kansas and Washington, female workers assembled the complex aircraft despite constant design changes and technical problems. They installed the troublesome R-3350 engines, rigged the remote gun turrets, and connected the pressurization systems. When B-29s began bombing Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands in late 1944, every aircraft represented countless hours of women's labor. The bombing campaign against Japan escalated through early 1945. General Curtis LeMay switched tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks on Japanese cities. These raids caused horrific destruction and casualties. The ethical debates about strategic bombing remain contentious decades later. But from a military perspective, the raids devastated Japanese industrial capacity and will to resist. They required continuous replacement of aircraft, bombs, and supplies, all provided by American production. Island campaigns consumed enormous quantities of material. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and earlier battles required amphibious assaults against fortified positions. American forces used overwhelming firepower to reduce defenses before sending troops ashore. Naval gunfire support saw battleships and cruisers firing thousands of shells. Aircraft dropped tons of bombs. Artillery pounded enemy positions. The expenditure was colossal, and it was sustainable only because American factories continuously replenished supplies. The invasion of Okinawa, April through June 1945, showcased this material superiority. American forces used over 500 ships and more than 550,000 personnel to assault the island. They faced desperate resistance from Japanese forces who knew Okinawa was Japan's last significant defense before invasion of the home islands. The battle lasted 82 days. It cost more than 12,000 American killed. But American forces won through material exhaustion of Japanese defenders. American artillery fired 2,500,000 shells during the Okinawa campaign. Aircraft dropped 70,000 tons of bombs. Supplies flowed continuously from ships offshore. Japanese forces, cut off and surrounded, ran out of everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies. They fought courageously but couldn't overcome material disparity. American industry made the victory possible, and women were American industry's workforce. WASP pilots played crucial roles throughout the Pacific War. They ferried aircraft from American factories to embarkation points. They tested repaired aircraft to ensure airworthiness. Some WASP pilots delivered aircraft to Alaska for transfer to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements. Their work ensured that the flow of aircraft to combat zones never stopped. 38 WASP pilots died during the war, several in crashes while ferrying aircraft. Their service went unrecognized for decades. August 1945 brought the war's end. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th forced Japan's surrender. The B-29s that carried those weapons, Enola Gay and Boxcar, were aircraft women built. The bombs themselves involved women's labor in various Manhattan Project facilities. The surrender ceremony on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri occurred on a battleship where women had contributed to its construction and supply. The Pacific War ended because American industrial capacity made Japanese resistance futile. Every metric favored the United States overwhelmingly. Aircraft production, shipbuilding, troop numbers, logistics capacity, America held insurmountable advantages in all categories. Japan couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. And that enemy's production capability existed because women entered factories and built the sinews of war. The cost they paid victory came at prices that balance sheets don't capture. Women who built weapons often sent loved ones to war carrying those weapons. The intimate connection between home front and battlefield created emotional burdens unique to this conflict. Gold Star mothers, women who'd lost sons in combat, went to factory jobs after receiving devastating telegrams. They welded ship hulls while grieving children who would never come home. They riveted aircraft wings while remembering boys who'd learned to walk holding their hands. They assembled ammunition while knowing that bullets couldn't bring their sons back. For these women, factory work became both distraction from grief and continuation of sons' service. They built weapons to finish what their boys started, to ensure their deaths meant something. Wives worked while husbands fought. The separation strained marriages even when both partners remained faithful and supportive. Women became independent, earning their own money and making their own decisions. They discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Meanwhile, husbands faced combat's horrors and return changed. The couples who reunited after years apart sometimes found themselves strangers. Some marriages survived. Others didn't. Divorce rates climbed during and after the war as relationships broke under these strains. Workplace deaths occurred with regularity that would be considered criminal negligence today. Women fell from scaffolding. They were crushed by falling equipment. Machinery caught clothing or hair and dragged women into gears and presses. Chemical exposures caused both immediate injury and long-term illness. Explosions in ammunition factories killed workers instantly. The exact number of women who died in defense work is unknown because comprehensive records weren't kept. It was certainly hundreds and possibly thousands. Non-fatal injuries were far more common. Burns from welding or molten metal left permanent scars. Crushed hands and fingers ended careers. Hearing damage from factory noise caused deafness. Toxic chemical exposures created health problems that appeared years later. Cancers, neurological problems, and respiratory diseases afflicted women who'd worked with materials nobody realized were dangerous. The physical exhaustion accumulated. 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days per week, for months or years. The human body isn't designed for this. Women operated machinery while exhausted, increasing accident risk. They made mistakes born of fatigue. Their health deteriorated. Weight loss, chronic illness, depression, and physical breakdown plagued many women workers. Some collapsed at work and required hospitalization for exhaustion. Childcare struggles created constant anxiety. Women worried about children left with inadequate supervision. Accidents happened to kids left home alone or with barely competent caretakers. Some children suffered neglect even though mothers were working to support them. The guilt women felt was enormous. They were doing essential war work, but their children paid prices for mom's absence. Racial discrimination added layers of injustice for women of color. Black women faced discrimination from employers, coworkers, communities, and even other women. They received the worst jobs, lowest pay, and least respect. Housing discrimination forced many Black women into long commutes or substandard housing near factories. After facing prejudice all day at work, they returned to segregated communities where Jim Crow laws enforced inequality. Sexual harassment and assault created hostile work environments. Women had limited recourse against supervisors who demanded sexual favors. Coworkers who made workplaces unbearable faced few consequences. The culture assumed women should tolerate whatever happened and be grateful for employment. Some women quit jobs because harassment became intolerable, sacrificing income rather than endure abuse. The emotional toll of constant stress, fear, grief, exhaustion, discrimination, and harassment is incalculable. Women carried burdens that would break many people. They carried them while building weapons of war. They carried them while maintaining homes and raising children. They carried them while volunteering in communities and supporting war efforts in dozens of ways. The resilience required is almost incomprehensible. And for what? Victory, certainly. Allied victory in World War II was worth the sacrifices. But personally, individually, what did women gain? That question has a complicated answer that arrived in August 1945. When Japan surrendered, American society immediately began pushing women back into traditional roles. The cost women paid for victory included the betrayal that came with victory itself. The Great Displacement, August 14, 1945. Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day. Americans celebrated in streets across the nation. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. Strangers embraced. Church bells rang. Fireworks exploded. The war was over. America had won. And within weeks, millions of women lost their jobs. The displacement happened with stunning speed. Defense contractors canceled contracts immediately. Factories that had operated 3 shifts around the clock shut down or converted back to civilian production. Shipyards that had launched vessels every few days laid off entire workforces. Aircraft manufacturers that had employed tens of thousands began termination notices before the ink dried on surrender documents. The message to women workers was clear and brutal: your country doesn't need you anymore. Statistics tell the story. In August 1945, roughly 20 million American women worked outside the home. By the end of 1946, 4 million women had left the workforce, many involuntarily. Defense industries saw the most dramatic cuts. The aircraft industry that had been 65% female shrank to a tiny fraction of wartime size and dismissed nearly all women workers. Shipyards closed or reduced operations to peacetime maintenance levels. Women welders, riveters, and crane operators received pink slips. What makes this particularly painful becomes clear in the surveys. Studies conducted during the war showed that 75 to 80% of women workers wanted to keep their jobs after the war ended. They weren't working temporarily until husbands returned. They wanted careers. They enjoyed earning income, valued financial independence, and took pride in work they'd mastered. Many had become primary breadwinners and couldn't afford to quit even if they'd wanted to. Single women, widows, divorcees, and women whose husbands earned insufficient income needed employment. Society didn't care what women wanted. The cultural narrative shifted immediately. Magazines that had praised Rosie the Riveter now ran articles about returning to traditional domesticity. Advertisers depicted happy homemakers. Radio programs and films emphasized women's proper place in the home. Government propaganda that had recruited women into factories now recruited them back out. The message was consistent. Men needed those jobs, women belonged at home, and the wartime emergency had ended. Employers fired women using policies designed for exactly this purpose. Last hired, first fired seniority systems ensured women left first, since they'd been hired during the war. Union contracts often contained clauses requiring dismissal of women when men became available. Some facilities simply announced that female employees were terminated effective immediately. Others reduced hours until women quit voluntarily. Pay cuts made jobs unsustainable for workers who needed income. Women who resisted faced enormous pressure. Co-workers ostracized them. Supervisors harassed them. Communities gossiped that women taking men's jobs were selfish and unpatriotic. The same society that had called factory work patriotic duty now called it unwomanly. Women who wanted to keep working were portrayed as preventing veterans from supporting families. The guilt-tripping was relentless and effective. Some women fought back. Labor unions supported some equal rights efforts, though most unions prioritized male members. A few employers recognized that women workers were skilled and tried to retain them. But these were exceptions. The overwhelming trend was displacement. Women who'd proven themselves capable were told capability didn't matter, gender did. The economic impact on displaced women was severe. Women who'd earned factory wages supporting families suddenly had no income. Job hunting revealed that women's jobs, secretarial work, teaching, nursing, paid a fraction of factory wages. Women took substantial pay cuts to find any employment. Some became dependent on husbands or fathers after years of independence. For many women, this felt like losing freedom they'd earned. Black women faced particularly harsh displacement. They'd been last hired during the war and were first fired after it. The defense jobs that had offered escape from domestic service vanished. Black women found themselves pushed back into the lowest paying, least respected positions in the economy. The brief window of opportunity slammed shut. Racial discrimination ensured that Black women bore disproportionate costs of demobilization. The military women's organizations disbanded or shrank dramatically. WAC, WAVES, and other branches reduced to skeleton crews. WASP disbanded entirely in December 1944, before the war even ended, and the pilots went home with no recognition of their service. The message was clear. Women's military service had been tolerated during emergency, but wasn't wanted in peacetime. What stands out is how quickly society wanted to forget. Within months of VJ Day, Rosie the Riveter began fading from cultural memory. The posters came down. The songs stopped playing. Media coverage shifted to returning veterans and the challenges of reconversion. Women's contributions became footnotes. The narrative became that men won the war while women waited at home, a complete rewriting of history that was happening while women who'd built the weapons of victory were being fired. The betrayal cut deep. Women had answered their country's call. They'd proven themselves capable of work society said they couldn't do. They'd tolerated discrimination, harassment, inadequate pay, and dangerous conditions. They'd sacrificed, struggled, and delivered beyond anyone's expectations. They'd built the arsenal that won the war. And their reward was unemployment and being told to go home and be grateful. But something employers, politicians, and society didn't fully understand. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. Women who'd operated complex machinery, managed technical work, and earned substantial incomes wouldn't forget what they'd accomplished. They'd proven something to themselves that no amount of propaganda could erase. The seeds of change had been planted, even as the country tried desperately to restore the status quo. What they proved. The most important thing women proved during World War II was simple but revolutionary. The limitations society placed on them were artificial. Every argument about what women couldn't do collapsed when confronted with reality. Women could perform physically demanding work. They could master technical skills. They could handle complex machinery. They could work in dangerous conditions. They could meet production quotas. They could do it all while managing households and raising children. The only thing preventing women from these roles had been prejudice, not capability. The myth of physical weakness evaporated. Yes, men on average are physically stronger than women on average. But on average doesn't mean every individual man is stronger than every individual woman. Physical strength wasn't the primary requirement for most war work anyway. Riveting required precision and endurance more than raw strength. Welding demanded steady hands and spatial awareness. Operating machine tools needed careful attention and technical understanding. Women excelled at these tasks. The idea that women couldn't understand technical work was demolished. Women read complex blueprints. They calculated measurements and tolerances. They troubleshot mechanical problems. They operated precision equipment that required understanding of how systems worked. Educational testing showed women learned technical skills as quickly as men, sometimes faster. The assumption that mechanical and mathematical thinking was masculine proved baseless. The notion that women couldn't handle workplace stress fell apart. Factory work during war production meant constant pressure, long hours, and high stakes. Mistakes could cost lives. Women handled this stress while carrying additional burdens, childcare responsibilities, household management, worry about loved ones overseas. They kept working through exhaustion and grief. The resilience they demonstrated exceeded what most people thought possible. Economic independence proved transformative on personal levels. Women who earned their own income made their own decisions. They opened bank accounts, managed money, and controlled their economic lives. For many women, this was the first time they'd experienced financial autonomy. The confidence that came from earning a living wage changed how women saw themselves. They weren't helpless dependents, they were capable adults. The impact on younger women and girls was profound. Daughters watched mothers go to factory jobs. They saw women doing work that hadn't existed for women before. They absorbed the message that women's capabilities extended beyond traditional roles. These girls grew up with expanded sense of what was possible. When the women's movement emerged in the 1960s and 70s, many leaders were women who'd been girls during World War II and remembered what their mothers and older sisters accomplished. Women proved they could work alongside men as colleagues. The fears that integrated workplaces would descend into chaos or immorality didn't materialize. Men and women worked together, focused on jobs that needed doing. Certainly problems existed, harassment and discrimination were real, but the facilities functioned. Production increased. Quality remained high. The sky didn't fall because women entered male spaces. Military service proved especially significant. Women in WAC, WAVES, WASP, and other organizations demonstrated that females could serve in uniform, follow orders, maintain discipline, and perform military duties. The arguments against women in military roles crumbled in face of evidence. Women could fly aircraft. WASP pilots handled every plane in the American arsenal. Women could serve overseas, WAC units deployed to combat theaters. Women could face danger, nurses served under fire and as prisoners of war. Perhaps most importantly, women proved they could balance multiple roles simultaneously. Society had always assumed women could be either homemakers or workers, never both. The war forced millions of women to be both. They worked factory shifts and raised children. They managed households and volunteered in communities. They maintained families and contributed to war production. Yes, it was exhausting. Yes, they needed more support than they received. But they proved it was possible. The self-image transformation mattered more than society recognized at the time. Women who'd seen themselves as weak discovered strength. Women who'd accepted limitations on their abilities found out those limits were false. Women who'd believed they needed male protection learned they could protect themselves. This psychological shift was permanent. Individual women might return to traditional roles after the war, but they knew those roles were choices, not biological inevitabilities. All of this evidence, millions of women performing every kind of work successfully, created a factual foundation for future equality arguments. When women demanded equal rights in later decades, they could point to World War II and say, "We proved we could do this." Opponents couldn't credibly claim women lacked capability when women had literally built the weapons that won the war. The historical record was clear. But proving capability didn't immediately translate into social change. The 1950s saw intense cultural pressure toward traditional domesticity. Women who'd worked in factories became suburban housewives. The baby boom began. Television and advertising celebrated homemaker ideals. On surface level, It looked like society had successfully pushed women back into traditional roles and everything had returned to normal. Except it hadn't. The knowledge remained. The experience couldn't be erased. And slowly, incrementally, things began to change. The long-term victory, the 1950s, don't look like a period of women's advancement. Cultural imagery from the era emphasizes domesticity, conformity, and traditional gender roles. But beneath the surface, forces unleashed during World War II continued operating. Women's workforce participation dropped after the war but never returned to pre-war levels. By the mid-50s, women were re-entering the workforce in substantial numbers, though usually in traditional female occupations rather than the industrial jobs they'd held during the war. The difference was that women now knew industrial work was possible. The psychological barrier had broken. When economic opportunities appeared, women remembered they'd done difficult work before and could do it again. The factory experience became family history passed from mothers to daughters. During the war, "I built bombers" wasn't just a memory, it was proof of capability. Educational patterns began shifting. Women who'd worked during the war wanted different futures for their daughters. They encouraged education and career preparation. College enrollment for women increased through the 50s and accelerated in the 60s. Professional schools that had excluded women faced growing pressure to admit them. The assumptions that women didn't need education because they'd just be homemakers weakened. Betty Friedan's research for The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, included interviews with women who'd worked during World War II. These women described the satisfaction they'd found in wartime work and the emptiness they felt in post-war domesticity. Friedan identified the problem that as no-name, educated, capable women confined to roles that didn't challenge them. Her book became a catalyst for second-wave feminism, and wartime experiences informed the movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 included Title VII, which prohibited employment discrimination based on sex. The inclusion of sex discrimination was partly accidental. A Southern congressman added it hoping to kill the bill, but it became law and created legal framework for workplace equality. Women could now sue employers for discrimination. The law didn't immediately change everything, but it provided tools for fighting inequality. Women's re-entry into the workforce accelerated through the 60s and 70s. This time, they weren't leaving when economic conditions changed. They pursued careers, not just jobs. They demanded equal pay and promotion opportunities. They challenged workplace policies that discriminated against women. When they made these demands, they could point to World War II as precedent. Women had done these jobs before, so arguments about women's incapability rang hollow. Military integration proceeded slowly but steadily. The military resisted allowing women into combat roles or treating female service members equally with males. But the wartime women's organizations had established precedents that couldn't be entirely erased. WAC became a permanent part of the Army. Waves continued in the Navy. Each generation of women who served expanded what was considered acceptable. The process took decades, but it built on foundations laid during World War II. WASP finally received recognition. In 1977, more than 30 years after the organization disbanded, Congress granted WASP pilots veteran status. In 2009, President Obama signed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to WASP. By then, many of the pilots had died without seeing their service acknowledged. The recognition came late, but validated what they'd accomplished. The women's liberation movement of the 70s drew explicit connections to wartime experiences. Activists referenced Rosie the Riveter as symbol of women's capability. They used wartime production statistics to counter arguments that women couldn't handle demanding work. They pointed out that society had needed women when convenient and discarded them when men wanted jobs back, framing it as exploitation that shouldn't be repeated. Slowly, the manufacturing sector reopened to women. By the 1980s and 90s, seeing women in factories was no longer shocking. The percentage never reached wartime levels. Manufacturing itself declined as America's economy shifted toward services, but women's presence became normalized. The pioneering work done during World War II made this normalization possible. Education statistics show the long-term impact. Women now earn the majority of bachelor's degrees and substantial percentages of graduate and professional degrees. Medical schools, law schools, and business schools enroll roughly equal numbers of women and men. This educational parity creates career opportunities that didn't exist when women were excluded from higher education. The path from Rosie the Riveter to female doctors, lawyers, and executives isn't straight, but it's traceable. Workforce participation tells a similar story. Today, women are nearly half the American workforce. They work in virtually every occupation and industry. Discrimination and inequality persist. The gender pay gap remains real. Sexual harassment continues, and women face barriers men don't. But the landscape is unrecognizable compared to 1941, when most occupations were closed to women entirely. Cultural attitudes shifted fundamentally. The idea that women belong exclusively in domestic roles now seems archaic. Most Americans accept that women can and should pursue careers if they choose. Arguments that women lack intellectual capability or physical ability to perform demanding work are generally rejected. Society hasn't achieved full equality, not even close, but the baseline assumptions changed. And those changed assumptions trace back to World War II. That's when American society was forced to test its beliefs about women's limitations and discovered those beliefs were wrong. The war created a mass experiment in women's capability, and the results were undeniable. Society couldn't go back to claiming women can't do something after millions of women successfully did it for 4 years. The legacy also includes darker elements. The displacement after the war created lasting distrust. Many women who'd been fired in 1945 remained bitter decades later. They'd given everything to the war effort and been discarded. That betrayal informed later activism. Women determined not to let society exploit them again and then push them aside. The feminist movement's wariness of being used and discarded has roots in the post-war displacement. The experience also highlighted childcare as a critical issue. The wartime childcare centers funded by the Lanham Act proved that public childcare was possible and beneficial. When the war ended, these centers closed and mothers struggled. The ongoing debate about childcare, work-family balance, and societal responsibility for supporting working parents connects to wartime experiences that demonstrated both possibilities and limitations. The long-term victory isn't complete. Women still face discrimination, harassment, and inequality. But the trajectory is clear. From 1941 to present represents dramatic social change, and World War II was the inflection point. That's when possibility became reality, when assumptions were tested and failed, when women proved what they could accomplish given opportunity. Rosie the Riveter became an enduring symbol, not the J. Howard Miller poster that wasn't even famous during the war, but the concept of women's strength and capability. The image has been reused, reimagined, and referenced countless times. It appears in protests, political campaigns, and popular culture. It represents women's empowerment not just during one war, but as an ongoing principle. That's the real legacy, not just what women accomplished during the war, but what those accomplishments made possible afterward. Why Rosie was the key? Let's answer the question directly. Why was Rosie the Riveter actually the key to Allied victory in World War II? Because without women entering the workforce, American production wouldn't have reached levels necessary to win the war. It's that simple and that profound. Run the counterfactual. Imagine America tries to fight World War II without recruiting women into defense industries. The math doesn't work. 16 million men leave for military service. That creates a massive labor shortage in existing industries. Now the government demands that industry triple or quadruple output while losing 30% of its workforce. It's impossible. Without women workers, aircraft production reaches maybe a third of actual levels, maybe. Instead of 300,000 aircraft, perhaps America produces 100,000. That's still substantial, but it's not enough to achieve air superiority over both Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. The bombing campaign against Germany is reduced in scale and effectiveness. The Pacific Island hopping campaign lacks necessary air support. The war drags on. Shipbuilding suffers even more dramatically. Building ships is labor-intensive. Without women welders and shipfitters, Liberty ship production collapses. Maybe America builds 1,000 ships instead of nearly 3,000. The Atlantic convoy system struggles to supply Britain. The Pacific logistics train can't support aggressive offensive operations. Forces already deployed face supply shortages. Tank and vehicle production drops proportionally. Artillery and ammunition manufacture can't meet demand. The entire supply chain that kept Allied forces advancing grinds down under scarcity. American commanders face the same problems German commanders dealt with: insufficient equipment, inadequate supplies, and forces that couldn't sustain offensive operations. The crucial point: every delay means more casualties. If the war in Europe lasts another year because production shortfalls delay D-Day to 1945 or 46, hundreds of thousands more people die. Jews in concentration camps die waiting for liberation. Soviet casualties mount as the Eastern Front grinds on. Civilian casualties in occupied territories accumulate. American servicemen die in a longer war. The atomic bomb program might not complete before invasion of Japan becomes necessary, resulting in catastrophic casualties on both sides. The Pacific War without adequate production support means island campaigns take longer and cost more. Okinawa might be impossible. Invasion of Japan becomes necessary because the bombing campaign can't generate sufficient pressure without enough B-29s. Casualty estimates for invading Japan ranged from hundreds of thousands to millions. Those casualties don't happen because American production, built by women, made invasion unnecessary. There's also the Soviet question. If American production can't supply both European and Pacific theaters adequately, maybe America prioritizes Europe and the Pacific War extends years longer. Or maybe America focuses on Japan and the Soviets push further west into Europe before Germany collapses. The post-war map looks completely different. The Cold War has different dynamics. World history changes. Economic factors matter too. American war production cost roughly $340 billion, about $4 trillion in current dollars. That's sustainable because American industry is productive enough to supply military needs and civilian needs simultaneously. If production drops by half because women aren't working, either civilians face much harsher rationing or the military gets less. Either way, sustaining the war effort becomes more difficult. There's also the strategic calculation from enemy perspectives. German and Japanese leaders watched American production with growing despair. They knew they couldn't match it. That knowledge influenced strategic decisions. If American production had been substantially lower, Axis powers might have calculated they could still win a war of attrition. The mere existence of overwhelming American production affected enemy morale and strategy. The argument isn't that women alone won the war. Obviously not. Soviet forces did the majority of ground fighting in Europe and suffered the most casualties. British forces held out when America wasn't yet in the war. Chinese resistance tied down Japanese forces. Allied victory was a combined effort. But the American production advantage was decisive, and American production depended on women's labor. There's no scenario where America fights World War II the way it actually happened without women workers. The production miracle that overwhelmed Axis forces with material superiority required women building the material. Every alternative scenario involves a longer war with more casualties and uncertain outcome. Women didn't just contribute to victory, they made victory possible in the time frame it occurred with the casualty levels that resulted. That's why Rosie the Riveter was the key. Not because women were more important than soldiers, sailors, and airmen fighting. Obviously, the people in combat were essential. But because those combat forces needed weapons, vehicles, ships, aircraft, and supplies that American industry provided. And American industry operated on women's labor. The nation asked women to do something unprecedented. Women answered. They transformed themselves from a largely domestic workforce into an industrial powerhouse. They learned new skills, endured harsh conditions, tolerated discrimination, and worked through exhaustion. They built the arsenal of democracy rivet by rivet and weld by weld. They proved that women could do work society claimed was impossible. And they shortened the war, saved lives, and secured victory. Then society thanked them by firing them and trying to forget what they'd accomplished. But history remembers. The statistics remember. The aircraft, ships, tanks, and ammunition remember. They exist in museums and history books as testament to what American industry achieved. And American industry in World War II was overwhelmingly female. When someone asks why America won World War II, the complete answer includes battlefield heroics, strategic decisions, technological innovations, economic strength, and allied cooperation. But the story can't be told honestly without talking about the women who built the weapons. American production can't be explained without explaining that women were the workforce. Victory can't be understood without understanding that Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda, she was reality. She was a widow with 2 daughters building bombers at Willow Run. She was a young woman from rural America learning to weld in a shipyard. She was a Black woman facing discrimination while manufacturing ammunition. She was a pilot ferrying fighters across the country. She was a nurse treating wounded soldiers under fire. She was millions of individual women doing impossible things because their country needed them. And she was the key. She was actually, undeniably, historically the key to Allied victory in World War II. American fighting forces won battles. American production won the war. And American production was women's work. That's not the story most textbooks tell. That's not how the war is usually remembered. But it's the truth. Rosie the Riveter was the key. She built victory with her own hands, and the world owes her a debt it never fully acknowledged.